Exotic pets can captivate with their beauty and uniqueness, but the trust placed in them can sometimes turn deadly. In this video, we explore some of the most chilling cases where beloved exotic animals became lethal. From a woman mauled by her trusted chimpanzee to a man fatally constricted by his pet snake and a bear owner killed in her own backyard, these shocking stories expose the risks of living alongside the untamed. Let's begin with the first story. On January 10, 2010, a biting winter wind swept through the quiet streets of Southwold, Ontario. Snow blanketed the fields and frost clung to the bare branches of the trees surrounding the rural properties on the outskirts of town. The morning light cut through the gray sky, illuminating the small, peaceful community. But behind the serenity of this picturesque scene was a man whose passion for the extraordinary would lead to a tragedy no one could ignore. Norman Buwalda was known in the area as a unique and eccentric figure. At 66 years old, he had spent decades cultivating his love for exotic animals, dedicating his time and resources to creating a private sanctuary on his sprawling property. Neighbors often spotted him tending to his enclosures or working on improvements to his animal habitats. To those who knew him, Norman was meticulous, detail-oriented, and deeply proud of his unusual lifestyle. He had spent years building his reputation as a responsible exotic animal owner, even serving as the head of the Canadian Exotic Animal Owners Association, where he advocated for those who shared his passion. Norman wasn't just a man with a fascination for exotic creatures, he was a dedicated caretaker who believed he had a special connection with the animals he raised. His 650-pound Siberian tiger was the crown jewel of his collection. Along with a lion, a cougar, and several smaller wild cats, the tiger was a source of both pride and controversy in the community. Despite meticulous upkeep of the enclosures and adherence to provincial regulations, Norman's collection of dangerous predators had long been a point of contention for his neighbors. Many worried about the risks posed by such powerful animals in a residential area. But Norman remained steadfast, often pointing to his spotless inspection record as proof of his capabilities. In 2004, his prized tiger attacked a 10-year-old boy visiting with his family. The boy, working on a school project about Siberian tigers, got too close to the enclosure and the tiger's claws reached through the fence, leaving the child permanently scarred. The incident sparked outrage and legal battles, but Norman faced no repercussions, retaining ownership of the tiger and continuing his work with the animals he loved. That cold January morning began like many others for Norman. He rose early, fed his dogs, and prepared to tend to the tiger that had become the centerpiece of his life. His routine, repeated countless times, had dulled his sense of the risks involved. Bowl of raw meat in hand, he approached the enclosure where the massive tiger paced in anticipation of its morning meal. Norman's setup mirrored professional zoos, with a large main cage for the tiger's enrichment and a smaller holding pen for safe feeding and maintenance. Protocol required luring the tiger into the holding pen before entering the main enclosure, but Norman chose to ignore these precautions. Viewing the tiger as more of a companion than a predator, he walked into the main cage, closing the gate behind him. The tiger was already waiting, pacing near the center of the cage. Its sheer size and muscular frame were a fearsome sign of the power it held, a power Norman had seen in action when the tiger attacked the 10-year-old boy years earlier. Yet Norman approached with confidence, setting the bowl of meat on the ground a few feet from the tiger. The animal moved toward the meal, its paws crunching on the frosty ground, and began to eat. But then, Norman made a fatal mistake. As he turned to leave the enclosure, he turned his back on the tiger. In the wild, turning one's back on a predator signals vulnerability, and even the most well-trained animals can't suppress their instincts entirely. The tiger, sensing the opportunity, abandoned its meal in an instant. With shocking speed, it lunged at Norman, knocking him off his feet. The sheer force of the tiger's body sent him sprawling to the ground, and before he could react, its powerful jaws clamped down on his neck. The tiger's teeth tore through flesh and muscle with ease, severing arteries and nearly decapitating him in a single motion. Pinned beneath the predator, Norman stood no chance of escape. The tiger's massive paws dug into his body, holding him in place as it began to drag him across the enclosure. Despite the raw meat it had been given moments earlier, the tiger's instincts had taken over entirely. Norman was no longer its caretaker, he was prey. For the next 2 hours, the tiger fed on Norman's body. It tore into his torso, consuming everything from his chest to his feet. The bowl of raw meat sat untouched in the corner, forgotten in the frenzy of the kill. When Norman's cousin arrived later that morning for an unannounced visit, she was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The tiger, its snout and paws smeared with blood, stood over what little remained of Norman's body. The sight sent her into a state of shock so severe that she required hospitalization and sedation for days afterward. When authorities arrived, they found the tiger pacing in its enclosure, its massive frame smeared with blood from what remained of Norman's body. Calm but imposing, the animal was secured with the help of wildlife professionals who sedated it before removing it from the property. The tiger was eventually sold to a private collector at an undisclosed location, fueling ongoing debates about the ethics of keeping such dangerous predators after fatal incidents. Investigators concluded that Norman had bypassed essential safety protocols, opting to feed the tiger directly rather than confining it to the holding pen. His overconfidence in his connection with the animal proved fatal, as the predator's instincts took over. Though his enclosures met legal standards, his handling practices exposed the dangers of keeping exotic creatures in captivity. Norman's death prompted renewed calls for stricter regulations in Ontario, highlighting the risks of underestimating the true nature of such animals. It was January 16, 2002, a cold winter day in Newark, Delaware, when neighbors in the Ridgewood Manor apartments noticed something unusual. A foul, putrid odor seeped through the walls of Ronald Huff's apartment, creeping into the neighbors' units. It was the kind of smell no one could ignore, the unmistakable stench of decay. Concerned, Ronald's neighbor, Jeff Wong, decided to investigate. What began as a simple inquiry soon turned into a horrifying discovery. Ronald Huff, 42 years old, was a man defined by his discipline and unique passions. A former soldier with a structured background, he lived alone in a small apartment in Newark, Delaware. But he was never without company. His companions were 7 Nile monitor lizards, giant prehistoric-looking reptiles that he adored. These creatures, some as long as 6 feet, roamed freely through his home. For Ronald, they weren't pets, they were his family. Known to his co-workers as Lizard Boy, Ronald's fascination with these reptiles was a defining part of his life. He frequently shared stories about his lizards at work, proudly displaying the scratches and minor bites he'd received while handling them. His colleagues knew him as a quiet yet enthusiastic individual, entirely devoted to his unusual companions. But beyond his workplace and his lizard collection, Ronald's interactions seemed limited. His focus remained on his pets and his solitary lifestyle. The lizards, resembling smaller Komodo dragons, were fearsome predators in the wild, known for their razor-sharp teeth, venomous bites, and predatory instincts. Ronald, however, treated them with affection, raising them from juveniles and allowing them to roam unrestricted. They slithered through his kitchen, lounged in his bedroom, and even ate at his dining room table. This coexistence, while fascinating, masked a darker reality. No matter how much Ronald cared for them, these animals were still wild at heart. Their behavior could turn unpredictable in an instant, as he would soon tragically discover. No one knows exactly what transpired in the days leading up to January 16th, but Ronald had not been seen for several days. His absence raised concern among neighbors, especially as a foul odor began emanating from his apartment. The stench, unmistakable as that of rotting flesh, suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. Though the exact details of Ronald's final moments may never be known, the grim scene discovered days later sent ripples of shock through the community. On that day, officers forced their way into Ronald's apartment and were immediately overwhelmed by the scene. The stench in the air was thick and suffocating, forcing the responders to cover their faces as they stepped inside. The dimly lit apartment was cluttered with furniture pushed against the walls to make room for the reptiles. In the middle of the room lay Ronald's body slumped against the door. His once recognizable features were horribly disfigured, with deep wounds covering his arms, legs, and torso. Large portions of flesh had been stripped away, exposing bone and sinew. The 7 Nile monitor lizards were still present, their snouts stained red with blood. They hissed and flicked their forked tongues at the officers, unperturbed by the commotion. The floor around Ronald was littered with scattered debris, bits of raw chicken, remnants of cockroach shells, which were a common food for the lizards, and overturned furniture, all signs of a chaotic and violent scene. Feeding time was often chaotic. Monitor lizards are highly reactive to routine stimuli, and any delay could have heightened their impatience. A single bite from their sharp teeth, combined with venom that causes pain, swelling, and infection, could have incapacitated Ronald. The lizards themselves showed no signs of fear. One of the larger animals stood near Ronald's body, towering over the bloody scene, while others darted across the room, their quick movements keeping the officers on guard. Their powerful tails swept through the debris, and their claws scratched against the hardwood floor. To the officers, the reptiles seemed to be guarding their territory, ready to defend their kill. It took time for wildlife officials to arrive and secure the lizards. The largest and most aggressive among them resisted capture, forcing the team to use specialized equipment to subdue it. The animals were eventually removed, but the haunting image of the scene lingered with those who witnessed it. Ronald's body was taken for examination, but the extent of the injuries made it impossible to determine an exact cause of death. Large portions of flesh were missing from his arms and legs, consistent with bite marks from the monitor lizard's sharp teeth. Deep lacerations marred his torso, and his face was nearly unrecognizable, with sections of skin and muscle torn away, exposing underlying bone. The injuries suggested prolonged interaction with the lizards, either during an attack or as part of post-mortem scavenging. His hands and fingers showed signs of defensive wounds, implying a struggle may have occurred. Investigators noted claw marks on his limbs and chest, likely caused by the reptiles climbing or restraining him. The autopsy revealed no signs of toxins or foreign substances that might have incapacitated him, but it was clear that his injuries were severe enough to have been fatal if inflicted while he was still alive. The damage to his body, coupled with the chaotic scene of the apartment, painted a gruesome picture. Whether Ronald succumbed to the lizard's aggression or they scavenged his body after a natural death remained unclear. What was certain, however, was that his remains bore the unmistakable imprint of the powerful and untamed creatures he had raised as companions. The grim reality of Ronald Huff's fate showed the deadly risks of keeping exotic pets behind closed doors. It was September 2022 in the quiet town of Redmond, Western Australia, a place where the hum of daily life was punctuated by the soft sounds of animals on Peter Eads' farm. Peter, 77, was well known for his devotion to his flock of 60 alpacas. He'd established the Agonis alpaca stud in 1997, and each of his animals had a name. The farm was his pride, a place where he tended to his creatures with care and attention. But one creature on his farm was different. an orphaned western gray kangaroo raised by Peter after he found it abandoned as a joey. Australia is home to over 50 million kangaroos, and while these animals are rarely a threat, they possess powerful weapons to ward off any intruders. Kangaroos have sharp claws, strong teeth, and muscular back legs capable of delivering deadly blows. The western gray kangaroo, the species Peter raised, stands about 4 feet 3 inches tall when fully grown, weighing 120 pounds. Peter's kangaroo had reached maturity in the spring of 2022, and like all male kangaroos, the surge of testosterone during the breeding season had made it aggressive. For 3 years, the kangaroo had lived alongside Peter's alpacas. It had grown accustomed to his presence, to the gentle strokes Peter would give it when he visited the paddocks. But that day, everything changed. The kangaroo, now fully matured, was no longer the docile animal it once was. With testosterone surging through its body, its natural instincts took over. Peter entered the paddock to feed the alpacas, as he had done countless times before. He saw the kangaroo bounding toward him and, as usual, expected a peaceful exchange. But this time was different. The kangaroo didn't approach with the familiar calmness he had come to expect. Instead, it charged at him. Peter barely had time to react before the kangaroo lashed out. With powerful strikes from its front legs, the kangaroo's claws raked across Peter's skin. The force of the blows sent Peter staggering back, but the kangaroo wasn't finished. It leapt into the air, using its muscular tail to maintain balance. In one swift motion, it kicked Peter with its strong back legs. The impact sent Peter crashing to the ground, stunned and unable to defend himself. The kangaroo, now fully in control of the situation, continued its assault. Peter tried to rise, but each time he attempted to get to his feet, another kick from the kangaroo knocked him back down. Its blows were relentless, powerful enough to crush bones and fracture skulls. Peter's head was struck in repeatedly. Blood pooled beneath him as his vision blurred, and the pain became unbearable. It was a rare and terrifying event. Kangaroo attacks on humans were uncommon, but when they did happen, the results could be devastating. The last fatal attack from a kangaroo had occurred in 1936. This one would shock the town of Redmond. It wasn't until hours later that a member of his family called by. They couldn't reach Peter by phone and grew concerned. When they walked to the back of the house, they spotted Peter lying unconscious in the paddock, his body bloodied and unmoving. Terrified, they called emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they rushed to Peter's side, but the kangaroo stood between them and their patient. The animal, still full of aggression, lunged at the paramedics, blocking their path to Peter. Despite the urgency of the situation, the kangaroo refused to let them near. It was only when police arrived and shot the kangaroo that the paramedics could approach Peter. Peter had succumbed to his injuries. The delay, the brutal assault had taken their toll. By the time they reached him, it was too late. His family and the town of Redmond were left in shock. Peter had always been kind to his animals, raising the kangaroo with love. But in the end, it was the kangaroo's instincts, not its training, that dictated the outcome. Peter had spent years caring for his animals, and the irony was not lost on those who knew him. He had once saved the joey, nursing it back to health, only to fall victim to the very creature he had raised. His kindness to his animals was well known in the community. Peter had always dreamed of being buried next to his favorite alpaca, a symbol of his dedication to the animals that had been his life. In the end, that dream came true. After his tragic death, his final resting place was beside the alpaca, as he had always wished, marking a quiet tribute to his lifelong bond with the creatures he cared for. Peter's death highlighted how easily nature can turn unpredictable, with even the most docile animals driven by instincts that can become lethal without warning. It was July 20th, 2022 when 29-year-old Elliot Sensman from Pennsylvania began his day as usual, tending to his beloved snakes. Known for his deep passion for reptiles, Elliot spent his days rescuing and rehabilitating snakes that others had abandoned. He had a special bond with these animals, and his expertise was unmatched. He handled everything from small garter snakes to the massive boa constrictors and pythons that others feared. But on this particular morning, as he entered the room to care for his snakes, he had no inkling that his life was about to end in the most tragic way. Elliot's love for snakes began at the age of 10. Over the years, he had developed an extensive knowledge of their care, understanding their needs and behaviors. He had spent the last 6 years focusing on rescuing snakes that had been abused or neglected, giving them a chance to heal and find new homes. His collection included several large snakes, but there was one in particular that required extra caution, an 18-foot boa constrictor which had a history of aggression. It had been rescued from a home where it had been poorly treated, leaving it distrustful of humans. Despite its size and temperament, Elliot had always approached the snake with the utmost care. He knew the risks but was undeterred by the challenge. That morning, like many others, Elliot began his routine by checking on the snakes. His first task was feeding and cleaning the enclosures, ensuring each snake was comfortable and properly cared for. As he moved from cage to cage, everything seemed normal until he reached the boa constrictor's enclosure. He paused. The snake's behavior had been erratic over the past few days, more restless, more unpredictable. It slithered in tight, erratic loops, pressing against the glass as though it couldn't find a place to settle. A slight unease crept over Elliot, but he dismissed it. The boa was still adjusting to its new life after years of abuse. He had seen this kind of restlessness before, especially in snakes with such a troubled past. But today, the snake's behavior was different. Its movements were more intense than usual. Elliot opened the cage slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the snake. It hissed, its tongue flicking the air, but that was typical. His hands were steady as he reached inside, familiar with the snake's temperament. Yet its movements were sharper, more agitated. Elliot remained cautious, aware that even well-known reptiles could become unpredictable when stressed. And then the snake struck. It lunged from the shadows, its powerful coils wrapping around Elliot's body with swift precision. Elliot's hands fumbled as he tried to respond, but the snake's grip tightened quickly. The boa constrictor's massive coils pressed against his chest, constricting with increasing pressure, squeezing the air from his lungs. Elliot's grandmother, who had been in the other room, heard the commotion and rushed to help. What she found was a horrifying sight. Her grandson, once full of life and energy, was now lying on the floor, his face turning pale as the snake tightened its grip around his neck. She screamed for help, but in the chaos it seemed there was no time. Elliot, always so cautious, had misjudged the situation. It was unclear whether it was already too late. With shaky hands, she dialed 911. When the Upper Macungie Township Police arrived, they found Elliot unconscious, showing symptoms of a heart attack. The snake's grip was still strong, its coils twisted around his neck, constricting further as it sensed its prey was weakening. The officers were paralyzed with indecision. The snake was massive, easily over 15 feet in length, and they couldn't risk shooting it in the head. A miss could injure Elliot. After a tense few moments, the officers took action, firing at the snake's body. The rounds weren't enough to kill the animal, but they were enough to make it loosen its grip, allowing the officers to pull it off Elliot. As soon as the snake was removed, paramedics rushed to Elliot's side. He was quickly transported to Lehigh Valley Hospital, Cedar Crest. But despite their best efforts, Elliot never regained consciousness. For 4 days, he remained in critical care, fighting for his life, but his body had already been deprived of oxygen for too long. On July 24th, Elliot Sensman passed away. The cause of death was later confirmed as anoxic brain injury caused by the constriction. The news of Elliot's death sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, family, and colleagues were left in disbelief. Elliot had dedicated his life to rescuing snakes, understanding their nature better than anyone else. He had always been the person people turned to when a snake was in trouble, and now one of the very creatures he loved so much had taken his life. His mother, Heather, couldn't understand how something so tragic could happen to someone so careful, so dedicated. "My son was unique and kind," she said in an interview. "He should still be with us today." In the months that followed, the tragic incident became a topic of discussion, with many calling for more regulation of exotic pets, particularly snakes. While Elliot's love for reptiles was undeniable, his death highlighted the potential consequences of caring for such creatures, especially when their behavior is unpredictable due to past trauma. The legacy of his work, however, would live on in the countless snakes he had helped, and the awareness he had raised about the importance of proper care and rehabilitation for animals in need. It was May 2018, a warm Saturday in Texas. The morning sun had already heated the air as Jeremy Sutcliffe and his wife Jennifer worked together in their newly settled garden. The house was small but cozy, and the garden had been a bit neglected in the chaos of moving. Now that the boxes were finally unpacked, they decided to spend the day getting the yard into shape. It was a peaceful start, or so it seemed. But the unexpected was just moments away. Jennifer knelt beside a row of flower beds, pulling stubborn weeds from the soft soil. Her hands, dirt-streaked from hours of work, moved rhythmically. The scent of fresh earth filled the air, and the sunlight warmed her back as she carefully tended to the plants. Jeremy, meanwhile, was trimming the grass around the yard, checking the newly planted shrubs to make sure they were secure. Every so often, he would glance over at Jennifer, making sure she was okay. He knew about how much this quiet time meant to her, and how she had been looking forward to setting up a relaxing garden space. A few feet from Jennifer, a few small trees lined the side of the house, their thin branches swaying gently in the breeze. The hum of distant traffic was the only sound that broke the peace. The dogs, small terriers, were roaming nearby, seemingly content with the stillness of the morning. Suddenly, Jennifer screamed. Jeremy turned sharply at the sound. He saw her backing away, eyes wide, as something slithered on the ground. His gaze darted to the source of her alarm. A large rattlesnake, its body coiled in the tall grass, was just inches from her feet. Its head was raised, its eyes locked on Jennifer. The rattling sound cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Jennifer took slow, cautious steps back, her hands still outstretched, trying to move away without provoking the snake. She called out to Jeremy for help, her voice sharp and urgent. At first, Jeremy thought she had just spotted a harmless garden snake, but as he moved closer, he saw the thick, patterned body of the western diamondback. His eyes locked on the raised head, its triangular shape unmistakable. This wasn't a small, harmless snake, it was a venomous one, and it was in a striking position. Without hesitation, Jeremy grabbed the nearest shovel, his hands steady despite the surge of urgency in his chest. He positioned himself between Jennifer and the snake. The rattle grew louder, warning him to stay away. But there was no choice now, he had to act. It was either his wife or the snake. With a swift, calculating swing, Jeremy aimed for the snake's head. The shovel hit with a sharp thud, severing the head clean from its body. For a moment, the snake's body twitched violently. Its headless form thrashed erratically in the grass, still moving as though it hadn't realized it was dead. Jeremy remained still, his eyes locked on the body, waiting for it to stop. The body twitched one last time and then went still. The rattling ceased. Jennifer, still watching from a safe distance, didn't move. The yard was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Jeremy and Jennifer exchanged a look but said nothing. They moved inside, leaving the garden behind. But the incident lingered in their minds, a reminder of the close call. After 10 minutes, the dogs needed to go out, and Jennifer decided it was safe enough. The yard was quiet and the sun was setting, but she didn't want to risk the dogs getting near the dead rattlesnake. She called Jeremy to move it. He nodded and walked to the garden. As he got closer, he saw the snake motionless and coiled by the fence, seemingly lifeless. Jeremy grabbed the snake by the tail, carefully lowering it into a grocery bag while keeping his distance from its head. But as his hand closed around the snake's head, it struck. Its fangs sank deep into his hand and venom surged into his veins instantly. Pain shot through his hand and his fingers went numb as the venom burned through his bloodstream. He called out to Jennifer for help, but the situation had already spiraled out of control. Though the snake's body was lifeless in the bag, its head, still alive, had delivered a final vicious strike. Jeremy tried to free his hand, but the snake's grip was relentless. Using his other hand, he attempted to pry it loose, but in doing so, the fangs sank into his finger, releasing another wave of venom. He finally wrenched the snake off and flung it aside, but the damage was done. His vision blurred and the dizziness overtook him. His body grew heavy, his movements sluggish. He turned to Jennifer, his strength slipping away. Without hesitation, Jennifer moved swiftly to Jeremy, assisting him to the car while dialing 911. She conveyed the urgency to the operator, requesting immediate help. With no time to wait for assistance, they began to drive to the hospital. The 30-minute journey stretched on as Jeremy's breathing grew shallow, his body succumbing to the venom's effects. Jennifer kept her focus on the road, maintaining contact with the operator. Midway through the drive, Jeremy's condition worsened. He collapsed and a seizure ensued. Jennifer pulled over near a church and followed the operator's directions to perform CPR until emergency responders arrived. When the ambulance reached them, paramedics swiftly loaded Jeremy inside. On the way to the hospital, his condition worsened significantly. The team decided to stop and transfer him to a waiting helicopter. The airlift brought him to a hospital equipped to handle the escalating crisis, where doctors immediately began intensive treatment. Jeremy's blood pressure dropped sharply and organ failure began. Medical staff administered 26 doses of anti-venom over several hours, but his condition showed minimal improvement. As a last resort, doctors induced a coma to stabilize his system. By the following evening, his vital signs improved slightly. Doctors decided to wake him from the coma. Jeremy opened his eyes, weakened but alive. The aftermath of the venom's effects induced severe kidney damage, multiple surgeries, and the amputation of 2 fingers. Despite these challenges, Jeremy survived. A month later, he was discharged from the hospital. Though chronic pain and lasting health issues remained, his survival marked a significant victory over the near-fatal encounter. It was the autumn of 2019 in Oxford, Indiana, a small town where neighbors knew each other by name and houses lined the quiet streets. Among these houses on the North Dan Patch Drive stood a house that most avoided, though there was little to suggest it was anything but ordinary. The modest bungalow, painted a faded blue, held a secret. Inside, it was alive, not with people but with reptiles. Over 140 snakes, large and small, filled rows of tanks, their sleek bodies moving in hypnotic patterns. For Benton County Sheriff Don Munson, this house was more than a hobby, it was a haven for his beloved collection. Among the residents was Simba, a 13-foot reticulated python and the crown jewel of Don's collection. While Don cared for these creatures with a careful hand, he'd learned to treat each one with respect. Handling these animals required both skill and caution. Even the gentlest of pythons could become unpredictable. Friends occasionally questioned the risks he took, reminding him of the power coiled beneath each snake's scales. But to Don, the thrill was worth it, and he carried on, trusting his experience and routine to keep him safe. But Don wasn't the only one enchanted by these creatures. His friend Laura Hurst shared his love for snakes. As a 36-year-old mother and fellow reptile enthusiast, Laura had been fascinated by wildlife since her childhood on a cattle farm. There, she often caught small garter snakes and marveled at their tiny, twisting forms. Over the years, her fascination had grown, and she eventually began to keep larger and more exotic species. Dawn's arrangement allowed her to house her own collection safely, and she visited twice a week to care for them, a routine she would soon wish she'd never started. Laura loved her time at the house, finding peace in the soft hum of the tank lights and the quiet rustling as snakes moved inside their enclosures. She had become familiar with each one's unique personality, knowing which needed gentle handling and which responded best when left undisturbed. These animals had become her companions, a world she alone could understand. Yet, even with her expertise, her confidence masked a danger she rarely considered. That Wednesday evening on October 30th, Laura arrived at the house as usual, parking her car in the driveway and stepping into the darkened interior. The lights in each tank cast an eerie glow in the dim rooms, shadows sliding over glass as she moved from tank to tank, checking on each of her snakes. Tonight, her focus was on her favorite, a sleek, muscular, 8-foot reticulated python she had raised from a juvenile. This snake had been calm for years, often allowing her to handle it without issue. But as she reached for it, a slight unease washed over her, something she couldn't quite explain. The snake was heavier than usual, and as she lifted it from the tank, its thick body draped over her shoulders like a live, warm scarf. Reticulated pythons are native to Southeast Asia and are among the longest snakes in the world, growing up to 20 feet and weighing as much as 165 pounds or 75 kilograms. Known for their strength, they kill by constriction rather than venom, wrapping around their prey and tightening until the animal suffocates. Despite the inherent danger in their predatory nature, they are kept as pets due to their relatively manageable care in captivity. Laura had handled them before, but tonight the snake's behavior was unusual. At first, the weight was familiar and reassuring, but gradually the python's grip tightened around her neck, its muscles pressed harder against her. The change was subtle, almost easy to miss. But as Laura shifted, trying to adjust the snake, its coils grew tighter, wrapping further around her neck and shoulders. She gently tried to loosen the grip, but the snake resisted. Its body was unyielding, a heavy loop that refused to let go. Laura struggled for air, her chest tight as the snake's coils tightened further. Her lips began to turn a deep shade of blue, and her eyes started to bulge as her breathing became increasingly labored. She couldn't scream for help, nor could she reach her phone. Everything was happening too fast. The pressure on her throat was suffocating, and the lack of oxygen caused her head to spin. As her vision blurred, a sense of helplessness washed over her. Within seconds, she slumped to the ground, her body going limp. The snake, unrelenting, continued to constrict around her, even though she was now motionless and unresponsive. Hours later, across the yard, Don noticed Laura's car still parked in the driveway as he looked out his window that evening. She usually finished her routine checks by now, so he decided to check in on her. Entering the house, he called her name. No response. He walked past the open tanks, his steps echoing through the silent rooms, until he entered the last room and found a scene that would haunt him forever. Laura was lying motionless on the floor, the snake's coils still draped loosely around her, its deadly grip now loosened, but too late. Don rushed forward, pulling the python away, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. He dialed emergency services, but his voice trembled as he spoke. It was already too late. Laura had been his friend, his confidant in the world of reptiles. Her death sent a shockwave through him, one he couldn't have predicted despite his years of handling snakes. Her passing was swift, merciless, and left him standing in a house that had once been filled with life, now quiet and empty, a cruel reminder of what had just occurred. In the aftermath of Laura's death, the community was shaken. Questions surfaced about Don's snake breeding operation. Had he followed the proper legal procedures? In Indiana, reticulated pythons were not regulated because they were not a native species, but there were no permits required, as long as the snakes were not venomous or endangered. Since 1978, 18 people in the US have died from snake constriction, yet incidents like Laura's were incredibly rare, often overshadowed by other dangers. Reptile enthusiasts pointed out that dogs caused far more injuries and deaths each year. Despite this, Laura's tragic fate brought national attention, and the town council quickly moved to introduce new regulations to ensure people were aware of who kept dangerous animals and where they were housed. On a frosty March morning in 2019, the small Czech village of Zidikov stirred to life beneath a pale winter sky. Nestled in the Moravian Silesian countryside, this quiet town was surrounded by snow-dusted hills and thick forests. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged friendly nods, and life moved at a slower pace. But beneath the calm of that frosty morning, a predator's cage held the beginnings of a tragedy, one that would leave blood in the snow and the village forever haunted by what escaped. Michael Prasek, a 33-year-old resident of Zidikov, was a man of contradictions. To many in the village, he was a mystery, both reclusive and friendly, deeply passionate but fiercely stubborn. He lived with his father in their modest family home on the edge of town, where he had turned their property into an unusual sanctuary for exotic animals. His fascination with wildlife had become an obsession in 2016 when he acquired Fufi, a young male lion. 2 years later, he purchased a lioness, adding Cleopatra to his collection and setting his sights on breeding the animals. Neighbors were uneasy from the start. Lions, after all, were not typical residents of the Moravian countryside. Concerns grew as the animals matured into powerful predators, each weighing more than 400 pounds. Fufi's deep roars echoed through the village at night, and Cleopatra's agile, muscular frame prowled behind the bars of her cage. Despite warnings from locals and even his own family, Michael insisted he had everything under control. For Michael, these lions were more than pets, they were his life's purpose. Every day he devoted hours to caring for them, hauling crates of meat to their enclosures, and meticulously maintaining their cages. He believed he understood them better than anyone, often telling others they were part of his family. But Michael's confidence blinded him to danger. Over time, his bond with the lions became a source of tension with neighbors and authorities alike. In 2018, Michael made national headlines after a shocking incident involving Cleopatra. On a summer afternoon, he decided to walk the lioness on a leash near his property. The sight of the enormous predator on a public road sent a cyclist crashing into her. Though no one was seriously injured, the incident amplified fears in the village and brought renewed scrutiny from local officials. Michael was fined for keeping the lions without proper permits, but enforcement proved difficult. Sanctuaries for larger predators were overcrowded, and the cost of relocating the animals was prohibitive. With no clear solution, Michael was allowed to keep the lions, much to the frustration of his neighbors. By March 2019, tensions surrounding Michael's lions had reached a boiling point. His father, who lived with him, repeatedly warned him of the risks. His sisters, who had once visited regularly, avoided the property entirely, fearing for their children's safety. But Michael remained defiant, convinced that his understanding of Fufi and Cleopatra set him apart from the others. On the morning of March 4th, the Moravian countryside was cloaked in frost, the air sharp and biting. Michael began his day as he always did, feeding the lions. Carrying a bucket of fresh meat, he trudged through the snow toward the enclosures. The sight of Fufi pacing behind the bars didn't faze him. This routine had become second nature. Unlocking the gate, Michael stepped inside the male lion's cage, entirely at ease, despite the imposing predator just feet away. He placed the bucket on the ground and turned to tend to the other tasks, never imagining the danger lurking in that moment. Fufi, now a fully grown and dominant male lion, moved with the power and speed of a predator honed by millennia of evolution. The moment Michael turned his back, the lion's instincts took over. Foofy lunged, his massive stride covering the distance in a single bound, and his lethal paw struck Michael square in the chest. The impact knocked Michael off his feet, sending him sprawling to the ground, dazed and unable to defend himself. Pinned beneath the monstrous predator, Michael was defenseless as Foofy delivered a second fatal strike. The lion's massive jaws clamped down around Michael's neck, severing arteries and cutting off his ability to cry for help. Blood stained the snow as Foofy's predatory instincts took over entirely, reducing Michael to nothing more than prey. The commotion drew the attention of Cleopatra the lioness, who quickly joined the frenzy. She moved with lethal precision as she sank her teeth into Michael's lifeless form. The pair of lions worked together with brutal efficiency, tearing at their keeper with the same ferocity they would show to prey in the wild. In mere moments, Michael's life was extinguished and his body was left unrecognizable under the combined force of the two beasts. When Michael's father arrived the next morning, alarmed by his son's lack of response to calls, he was met with a chilling sight. Foofy was pacing the enclosure, his golden eyes fixed on what remained of Michael's body, now reduced to little more than scattered remains in the snow. Cleopatra lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her massive presence almost serene. At first, Michael's father thought his son was asleep, but as he approached the gate, the gruesome truth became clear. Panicked and grief-stricken, Michael's father retreated and called the authorities. Police arrived shortly after, armed and prepared for the worst. To recover Michael's remains safely, they had no choice but to euthanize both lions. Foofy, still aggressive, charged at the responders and was shot on sight. Cleopatra, though calmer, was also euthanized shortly after. The family's property, once bustling with life, now stood empty and silent. The aftermath of Michael's death was a flurry of drama in the village and beyond. Animal rights activists condemned the killing of the lions, arguing that they were acting on instinct and should not have been kept in captivity to begin with. Others blamed Michael's stubbornness and criticized the lax enforcement of regulations that had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. For Michael's family, the loss was overwhelming. His father, unable to bear the memories of what had happened, moved away from Zidikov, leaving the house and its empty cages to decay. Over time, the property fell into disrepair, overgrown with weeds and shrouded in silence. The rusting cages and abandoned enclosures remained as a haunting reminder of the risks of keeping wild animals in captivity. Incidents involving exotic animals continue to occur, fueling protests and debates, yet little seems to change. These stories serve as grim reminders that fatalities are often preceded by warnings that go unheeded. Action only comes too late, after a life has been lost. Tragically, it's not just humans who pay the price. The animals are often killed in the aftermath. St. James and LaDonna's story began in West Covina, California, a town that bore witness to the unfolding chapters of their lives. They met as teenagers, fell in love, and became high school sweethearts. For years, they were inseparable, and their relationship blossomed amidst the expectations of family and friends who eagerly anticipated their union. But St. James, a tall and charismatic NASCAR driver with a deep passion for cars, hesitated. He feared marriage would anchor him, pulling him away from the thrill of racing and tinkering with engines. Still, in 1966, under mounting pressure, St. James finally agreed to marry LaDonna. On their wedding day, family and friends gathered in a small brick church, their faces lit with anticipation. LaDonna waited in her white dress, but St. James never arrived. Instead, he spent the day at a garage, lost in his true passion. News of his absence spread quickly, and the town's disappointment turned into outright disdain. For years, his name became synonymous with betrayal and cowardice. Seeking to escape the judgment of his community, St. James found solace in a newspaper advertisement. A merchant ship was seeking crew members for a long-distance voyage. The job promised adventure and anonymity, with all expenses covered. Despite having no experience on the sea, St. James saw an opportunity to leave his failures behind. He boarded the ship and embarked on a journey that would change his life forever. Months into the voyage, while near the coast of Africa, the ship suffered a mechanical failure and docked in Tanzania for repairs. During his time there, St. James joined a group of Tanzanian hunters and traveled with them into the forests. During one of their hunts, the group killed a female chimpanzee shortly after it gave birth, leaving the newborn to fend for itself. Stricken by the scene, St. James took the orphaned chimp under his care, naming him Mo. The bond they formed during those days in Tanzania became unbreakable. Returning to California was a logistical challenge, but St. James managed it with the help of German missionaries who secured his flight. When he arrived at the airport, he was greeted by his mother Estelle and an uninvited LaDonna who had come to confront him. Her anger melted into astonishment when she saw the tiny chimpanzee clinging to St. James. Mo's arrival softened the animosity between them, and in time, LaDonna forgave St. James. In 1970, they finally married in a modest ceremony. Mo, dressed in a tiny suit, served as their best man. The unconventional family found joy in their shared life, and Mo became their surrogate child. Tragedy, however, struck just a year into their marriage. LaDonna was diagnosed with cancer and required a hysterectomy. Devastated by the loss of her ability to have children, she considered leaving St. James. But he reassured her, reminding her that they already had a child in Mo. Together, they poured their love into raising the chimpanzee, marveling at his intelligence and emotional depth. For years, the family thrived, but the challenges of raising a wild animal in a suburban environment soon caught up with them. In 1998, a welder hired to repair Mo's cage accidentally left equipment behind, which shocked and frightened Mo. The chimp escaped and was missing for hours before being apprehended. During the incident, Mo caused damage to a police car and injured an officer. The following year, a visitor ignored warnings and placed her hand inside Mo's cage. Mistaking her red fingernail for candy, Mo bit her fingertip. These incidents painted Mo as a danger to the community, and authorities deemed him unfit to remain with the Davises. Police officers arrived at their home armed with tranquilizers and forcibly removed Mo. St. James resisted, only to be overpowered and pinned to the ground. Mo, distressed by the commotion, screamed and thrashed as officers tranquilized him and transported him to a holding facility. The Davises were heartbroken, their home now silent and empty without their beloved companion. After years of legal battles, St. James and LaDonna succeeded in transferring Mo to Animal Haven Ranch in 2004. The sanctuary promised Mo a safer environment and allowed the Davises to visit him regularly. On March 3, 2005, they arrived at the ranch to celebrate Mo's 39th birthday. They bought balloons, toys, and a frosted sheet cake filled with raspberry, eager to make the day special. When Mo saw them, his joy was immediate. He clapped his hands and howled, thrilled to be reunited. Though he may not have understood it was his birthday, he knew they loved him. LaDonna cut the cake and shared it with St. James before offering Mo his piece. Mo eagerly accepted, his gentle hands taking the cake with a quiet affection. It was a reunion filled with love, as if no time had passed. As the celebration unfolded, the family's joy was shattered by an unthinkable event. A young male chimpanzee escaped its enclosure and charged toward LaDonna. The chimp attacked, biting her hand and ripping off her thumb. St. James rushed to protect her, only to be ambushed by another, larger chimp. As the chaos unfolded, Mo did not join the attack but watched helplessly while the two chimps overwhelmed St. James, biting his face, gouging out his eye, and mutilating his body. They tore at his flesh, breaking bones and leaving him unrecognizable. LaDonna screamed for help as the chimps continued their brutal attack. The sanctuary's owner's son-in-law, Mark Carruthers, arrived with a firearm and shot both chimps, ending the assault. Paramedics rushed St. James to the hospital where doctors induced a coma to manage his extensive injuries. Despite multiple surgeries to reconstruct his face, St. James's life was forever altered. He became permanently reliant on LaDonna, who remained by his side caring for him as they both grieved the events of that day. In 2007, tragedy struck again when Mo disappeared from the sanctuary. Despite extensive searches, no trace of him was ever found. The Davises' hope of reuniting with Mo dwindled, leaving them with only memories of the chimp who had defined their lives for 3 decades. Today, St. James bears the physical scars of the attack, but the emotional wounds run deeper. "I can talk for days about Mo," he said in an interview. "I just miss him so much. I've never loved anything as much as I loved Mo." The Davises' story is a haunting reminder of the complexities and dangers of human relationships with wild animals. It was a dry, blistering day on the 400-acre farm tucked against the Vaal River in Free State, South Africa. The sun beat down relentlessly over the golden expanse of land, the grass swaying gently in the hot wind. The Vaal River, a lifeline in the otherwise arid land, trickled lazily along one edge of the property, offering a cool refuge to the creatures that called it home. Among them was Humphrey, a hippo that had been taken in at a young age after a river flood had left him stranded. Humphrey had been brought to the farm when he was just 5 months old, a helpless infant under the care of Marius Els, a 40-year-old former Army major turned farmer. Marius had a history of caring for wild animals, giraffes, rhinos, but nothing could prepare him for the hulking mass that would one day become his greatest companion. The hippo was growing fast. By the time he reached maturity, he was a formidable creature, nearly 2,600 pounds of muscle, with enormous jaws capable of cracking bones with ease. But at the time, Humphrey was still an oversized infant, his innocent eyes following Marius wherever he went, his huge ears twitching at every sound. Marius, who had trained him to open his mouth for teeth brushing and even ridden him in the water, believed that the bond they shared was unbreakable. To Marius, Humphrey wasn't just a wild animal, he was family. The farm was located on the edge of civilization, far from the nearest city. The surrounding land was sparsely populated, and Marius was used to living alongside nature's unpredictability. The river provided for both the land and the animals, and Humphrey had free rein to roam the 400 acres, though Marius made sure the hippo had access to a dam that he had built for his own comfort. For the most part, Humphrey stayed in a large pond he had claimed as his own, where the water was deep enough for him to submerge and move freely. He only wandered when curiosity or mischief called him to explore the rest of the property. Marius thought of Humphrey as the gentle giant, a creature so tame that he would obey Marius's calls. On several occasions, he would make his way to the nearby golf course, where golfers were often startled by the sight of a huge, lumbering hippo. To Marius, these escapades were harmless fun, a playful show of a bond forged between man and beast. Yet each time Humphrey escaped his enclosure, the danger of the situation became more evident. One morning, as Marius tended to the animals, he noticed the hippo had wandered off again. This time, however, Humphrey had ventured out of the farm and down to the river, where he encountered a man and his young grandson paddling along in a canoe. Marius had seen the exchange from a distance, and knowing Humphrey's territorial nature, he rushed to intervene. Humphrey's instincts kicked in as soon as the hippo saw the canoe. Without warning, he charged into the water, moving fast, powerful ripples forming behind him as he cut through the river with frightening speed. The pair in the canoe barely had time to react. The man and his grandson scrambled for safety, climbing the nearest tree as Humphrey circled below, agitated and relentless. Marius reached the scene and, with the sound of his whistle, called the hippo back. Humphrey paused, shaking his head before trotting back to Marius's call. He had been trained, or so Marius believed, to listen and obey. The locals who had witnessed the scene were less convinced. They saw an animal capable of unpredictable aggression, one that had grown beyond the control of even the man who had raised him. Days passed and Humphrey's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began to kill livestock on neighboring farms and even threw Marius from his back when the hippo no longer wished to be ridden. What Marius once thought of as playful now seemed dangerous. But he continued to dismiss the warnings, too blinded by his affection for the animal. To him, Humphrey was still that innocent young hippo, the one he had raised from a vulnerable age. But Humphrey was no longer a baby. He was becoming an adult, and with adulthood came a growing sense of dominance. His instincts were sharpening, and Marius, though experienced with wild animals, failed to recognize the shift in the hippo's behavior. The once obedient pet was beginning to test his limits. The playful nudges, once affectionate, now carried weight. The bites, which had once been gentle, grew more forceful. On November 12, 2011, tragedy struck. It began like any other day, with Marius heading out to visit Humphrey. The hippo was waiting for him at the riverbank, eager as always for attention. As Marius approached, he offered the usual apple as a treat, but Humphrey seemed different. The usual excitement was there, but something darker had crept into the animal's gaze. Marius attempted to pass the hippo to go down to the water, but Humphrey blocked his path. The massive animal shook his head and grunted, a low, guttural sound that resonated through the air. Marius brushed it off, but as he attempted to step around the hippo, the situation escalated. Humphrey's large jaws opened wide, and for the first time, Marius felt a rush of unease. The hippo's teeth were exposed, the sight of them sending a shiver down Marius's spine. He recognized the signs of aggression, but it was too late. Humphrey lunged, his powerful bite sinking into Marius's torso. The immense pressure of the hippo's jaws shattered Marius's bones. He gasped in pain, but there was no escape. Humphrey came for him again and again, the animal's raw strength overwhelming his former caretaker. Marius's body was soon swept into the river, his life extinguished by the very animal he had raised and trusted. It was hours before his body was discovered submerged in the cold water. The bond that Marius had believed was unbreakable had been shattered. What he had failed to see was the ferocity growing within Humphrey, a force of nature that no amount of training could suppress. Humphrey, the hippo he had once seen as a son, had become something far more dangerous. A wild animal driven by instinct, and in that moment, he had betrayed the only person who had ever cared for him. Hippos, weighing up to 4,000 pounds, are among the most dangerous animals in Africa, responsible for more human deaths each year than lions. Marius had underestimated this reality, believing his bond with Humphrey could tame the beast. It was October 4th, 2009, and the air was crisp in Ross Township, Pennsylvania, as the morning sun filtered through the trees. On a hilltop property, Kellyanne and Michael Waltz went about their usual routines, surrounded by their collection of exotic animals. For over 15 years, the couple had been licensed keepers of creatures most would only see in the wild: lions, tigers, leopards, and a towering black bear named Teddy. Their neighbors admired the family's dedication, often stopping to catch a glimpse of the animals from a safe distance. Yet, even with years of experience, the question lingered. What happens when years of familiarity meet the untamed instincts of a wild predator? Teddy was an enormous presence, standing over 6 feet tall when on his hind legs. Despite his immense size and power, he seemed gentle, even playful. His favorite treat was popcorn, and he often greeted Kellyanne with an eager growl as she approached his 15 by 15 foot enclosure. For Kellyanne, Teddy was more than just an exotic pet. He symbolized her lifelong passion for animals. But that passion would soon take a dark turn. Kellyanne's love for wildlife began in her youth as a competitive rider and member of the 4-H club in Massachusetts. Her dedication to animal care continued into adulthood. where she became a licensed exotic animal keeper alongside her husband Michael. Together, they earned their license in 1994, creating a sanctuary-like property housing lions, tigers, leopards, and servals. Despite the inherent risks, Kellyanne treated these creatures with meticulous care and respect, ensuring that every enclosure met or exceeded safety standards. In addition to her work with animals, Kellyanne was an active member of her community. She volunteered at the Faith Christian School in Roseto, where her children attended, balancing her devotion to her family, her faith, and her passion for exotic animal care. Neighbors frequently praised the couple's commitment to safety, noting the well-maintained cages and the apparent harmony between the Walls family and their animals. Kellyanne's confidence in her routine was supported by her years of experience. She had raised Teddy from a cub and maintained a structured relationship with him. Yet, as autumn settled in and the bear's instincts heightened, subtle warning signs began to emerge. That Sunday began like any other. Kellyanne, accompanied by her children, prepared to clean the cages and feed the animals. Her neighbor Scott was outside with his children, casually greeting her across the yard. As usual, Kellyanne headed to Teddy's cage first, wheelbarrow and shovel in hand. Her method was simple: distract Teddy with food while she worked. Tossing a pile of dog food to one corner of the cage, she watched as the bear eagerly devoured his meal. With the animal preoccupied, Kellyanne entered the enclosure to begin cleaning. Relying on routine and a quick distraction proved to be a deadly mistake. As Kellyanne turned to wheel out the waste, Teddy shifted his attention. In one swift motion, the 350-pound bear lunged. His weight slammed into her and his jaws clamped onto her shoulder with incredible force. Her children, still on the porch, screamed as the attack unfolded. Scott, hearing the commotion, ran to his house to grab his firearm. In the few moments it took him to return, Teddy had already inflicted catastrophic injuries. Kellyanne's efforts to resist were no match for the bear's strength, and she lay motionless by the time Scott arrived. Scott fired his first shot, hitting Teddy in the abdomen. The bear recoiled but remained standing, now focused on Scott. A second shot struck the bear's neck, forcing him to collapse. Even then, Scott fired additional rounds to ensure the bear was no longer a threat. When emergency responders arrived, the scene was one of devastation. Kellyanne's lifeless body lay inside Teddy's enclosure, the evidence of the attack unmistakable. Despite the responders' swift arrival, there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Teddy, too, had succumbed to the wounds he received, and his 350-pound body was a sobering display of the fine line between instinct and training. The attack raised immediate questions. Why was there no secondary barrier to separate Teddy during cleaning? How had the bear's growing agitation gone unnoticed? Despite being raised in captivity, Teddy's instincts as a wild animal had surfaced with devastating consequences. The Walls property had been considered safe, but was compliance with regulations enough to ensure safety? News of the incident spread quickly. Kellyanne was remembered as a dedicated caretaker, but scrutiny fell on the family's practices. Michael's license to house exotic animals had expired the previous year, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. Neighbors defended the family's intentions and practices, but experts pointed to the unpredictable nature of wild animals as the core issue. If regulations aren't enough to prevent these catastrophes, what is? The tragedy showed that no matter how long an animal is kept in captivity, its instincts remain. Kellyanne's story made clear the need for stricter safety measures and reinforced the dangers of treating wild predators as domesticated companions. Is it possible to truly coexist with creatures whose natural instincts are so powerful? What if the animals aren't just contained in rural enclosures, but instead roam freely within the walls of a city apartment? It was just another ordinary Wednesday morning in Moo, a small community in northeast Victoria, Australia. Paul McDonald, a 46-year-old farmer and loving husband, went outside to feed his pet deer, a cross between a red deer and an elk. He had owned the stag for 6 years, and the couple had always considered it a part of their family. The stag, standing almost 6 feet tall at the shoulder, had grown into a majestic creature under Paul's care. But what seemed like a routine task turned into a horrific tragedy. Paul's wife Mandy and their 17-year-old son Ethan heard a commotion coming from outside. As they rushed to investigate, they found Paul being viciously attacked by the animal he had raised and cared for. Mandy McDonald couldn't believe her eyes as she saw her husband being thrown around by the stag. The once docile creature, now acting aggressively, was pouncing on Paul with its sharp hooves and antlers. Mandy's heart raced as she sprinted toward the scene, driven by both terror and determination. The stag's antlers, nearly 2 feet long, thrashed violently, aiming at Paul with each twist of its head. Paul struggled, trying to fend off the attack, but the deer was too powerful. Mandy, getting closer, saw Paul's body being tossed about as the stag pinned him to the ground. Despite the fear and chaos, Mandy's resolve only hardened. She couldn't stand idly by. With a burst of adrenaline, she screamed at the stag, trying to distract it. The animal's wild eyes shifted toward her for a moment. Its aggression diverted just long enough for Paul to regain his footing, but the moment was brief. The stag, now more enraged, turned its focus back to Mandy and charged. Mandy braced herself for the impact. The stag's hooves struck her legs, sending an unbearable pain shooting up her body. She felt its antlers graze her upper arm, tearing through her jacket. The force of the blows nearly knocked her off her feet, but she refused to retreat. Despite the sharp pain and the threat of being gored, she fought to remain standing. Just as Mandy's strength started to falter, she heard Ethan's footsteps behind her. He appeared with a large piece of timber, his eyes wide with determination. Ethan swung the wood with all his strength, striking the stag in the head. The stag staggered back, dazed. Ethan swung again, and the stag, now disoriented, backed away, retreating into the nearby trees. Mandy collapsed next to Paul, bruised and battered but alive. Ethan helped her to her feet, and they turned to Paul. His body lay motionless, a pool of blood forming beneath him. His injuries were severe, and Mandy knew deep down it was too late. She tried to call out to him, but the words stuck in her throat. The first responders arrived moments later. The officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The stag, now at a distance, stood with its head lowered in a threatening posture, its massive antlers still sharp and lethal. The officers could see the animal's bloodshot eyes and wild stance. They were aware of the heightened aggression associated with the mating season, which made the situation even more dangerous. The stag snorted angrily, stamping its hooves in warning. The officers exchanged tense glances before slowly advancing. They knew that any wrong move could lead to another deadly attack. As they neared Paul's body, the stag snorted again, its massive body shaking as it prepared to charge. With little choice, the officers raised their weapons. The sound of gunfire shattered the tense silence echoing across the valley. The stag collapsed instantly, its body crumpling to the ground. The officers rushed to Paul's side, but despite their best efforts, he was already gone. His injuries were too severe. The farmer, who had been a well-known figure in the community, was pronounced dead at the scene. Mandy, still in shock and badly injured, was transported to the hospital. Ethan stayed by her side, the weight of the tragedy settling heavily on his shoulders. The community of Moo was left in disbelief. Paul, who had devoted his life to his family and farm, was gone in an instant, taken by the very creature he had raised. The attack sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of domesticating wild animals. Experts noted that attacks by deer were rare, but they emphasized that the mating season could intensify aggression in stags due to higher testosterone levels. Steve Garlick, chairman of the Deer Management Committee at the Australian Deer Association, explained that while deer are generally more likely to flee than fight, the mating season can push them to act out violently if they feel threatened or provoked. Mandy and Ethan, still recovering from their physical and emotional wounds, were left to navigate a future without Paul. The loss was crushing, yet they clung to the memories of a man who had shown them the true meaning of love, strength, and family. A heartfelt tribute was held for Paul, with friends and neighbors coming together to honor the kind and hardworking man they had tragically lost. Jerome and Sandra Harold were a happily married couple. Their home in Stamford, Connecticut had once been filled with the sounds of their daughter Susan's laughter and the busy hum of daily life. But as time passed and Susan married, the house fell silent. The couple, now alone, found themselves consumed by an emptiness that lingered in the halls. The house, once vibrant, now felt hollow. In an attempt to fill the void, they made a decision few would dare to make. They brought home a 3-day-old chimpanzee, choosing to raise it as their new child. The price was steep, $50,000, but to Sandra and Jerome it seemed worth it. They named the chimp Travis, after Sandra's favorite country music star, Travis Tritt. From the moment they brought him home, Travis became their world. They pampered him as if he were their own child, bathing him, feeding him, and even brushing his teeth. He slept in their bed, ate at their table, and joined them for outings. Travis quickly became more than just a pet, he was family. As the years passed, Travis grew bigger and stronger, and his relationship with the Harolds deepened. The couple even built a special room in their house for him, hanging tires from ropes for him to swing on. He learned to do things most people wouldn't expect of a chimpanzee, opening doors, using the remote control, even browsing pictures on the family computer. His charm and friendly nature made him a local celebrity. Neighbors, police officers, and even strangers recognized Travis as the beloved chimpanzee living in Stamford. He was known for his quirky habits, his obsession with baseball, his taste for ice cream, and his ability to log into the computer. The Harolds couldn't have asked for a better companion. But as with all creatures, time would change Travis in ways they never anticipated. In 2003, a strange incident set the stage for what was to come. Jerome, Sandra, and Travis were stuck in traffic when a passerby threw an empty soda can into their car, striking Travis. Without hesitation, Travis unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and chased after the culprit. The situation spiraled out of control, with Travis eluding officers for nearly 2 hours. He eventually returned to the car, but the spectacle led to a new law in Connecticut, banning the ownership of primates heavier than 50 pounds. Despite the chaos, Travis was exempted from the law, largely due to his status as a well-known, previously trained animal. Everything seemed to be fine in the family of Jerome and Sandra. With their animal, they appeared to be a happy couple, living a life that was calm and stable. But in 2004, tragedy struck. Jerome, after a long battle with stomach cancer, passed away. Sandra, now alone, was engulfed by grief. The house, once full of life, fell into darkness. Her sorrow had a profound effect on Travis, who had always seen Jerome as his alpha. As the months passed, Travis's behavior began to change. He had reached adulthood, now weighing over 200 pounds. The Stamford Animal Control Department voiced concerns about his size and strength, advising Sarah that it would no longer be practical to keep him in her home. But Sandra, still mourning Jerome, ignored their warnings. She withdrew from social life, spending her days sitting by the porch staring at the sunsets in a daze. The isolation took its toll on Travis. Without proper exercise, he grew overweight. His once shiny fur turned dull, and his body became flabby. The energetic chimpanzee who had once been the center of their world was now a shadow of his former self. By February 15, 2009, Sandra's emotional state had deteriorated further. On that day, she invited her longtime friend, Charla Nash, over for a visit. Charla had been a frequent guest at the Harold home. and Travis knew her well. After spending the afternoon at Mohegan Sun Casino, Charla and Sandra returned home, but something was off. Travis, usually eager for attention, was unusually quiet. His favorite ice cream sat untouched, and the TV and computer, two of his favorite things, were off. Concerned but not yet alarmed, Sandra mixed Xanax into Travis's tea before heading to bed, hoping to calm him. The next morning, February 16, 2009, Sandra woke to find Travis acting strangely. He wandered aimlessly around the yard, unresponsive to her calls. His movements were slow and his gaze seemed vacant. Growing more uneasy, Sandra called Charla to come over and help. The two women hoped that Travis would calm down with his favorite toy, a red Tickle Me Elmo. But when they approached him in the yard, something snapped. Seeing the toy, Travis went into a violent frenzy, attacking Charla with terrifying force. Travis threw Charla to the ground, and before Sandra could react, he sank his teeth into Charla's face. In an instant, he ripped off her lips, nose, and eyelids with brutal precision. Sandra, in panic, grabbed a shovel and struck Travis several times, but the chimp, unrelenting, continued his savage attack. His strength was overwhelming, and Sandra's efforts to stop him were futile. She rushed inside to grab a kitchen knife, praying it would be enough to stop the violence. She returned to the yard, the knife trembling in her hand, and plunged it into Travis's back. For a brief moment, Travis stopped, glaring at her with wild eyes. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back to Charla and resumed his attack with even more force. Charla's screams echoed through the neighborhood as Travis tore into her face. Seeing no other option, Sandra fled to her car, locked herself inside, and frantically called 911. The dispatcher's voice remained calm. "What's the problem with your friend?" she asked. "He ripped her face off. He's trying to attack me." Sandra screamed into the phone, her voice a raw, terrified cry. The dispatcher urged Sandra to stay safe, but Sandra could do nothing. Charla lay unconscious in the yard, her body mangled by Travis's relentless assault. The horror unfolded before Sandra's eyes as the chimpanzee continued his violence without hesitation. When Officer Frank Chiafiri arrived, he was met with an unimaginable sight. Travis, still enraged, was roaming the yard, attacking the police car. The chimp smashed the passenger window and unlocked the door, his anger undiminished. Fearing for his life, Officer Chiafari opened fire, shooting Travis 4 times. The chimp stumbled into the house, collapsed on his bed, and died. Charla was rushed to the hospital where she underwent multiple surgeries to reconstruct her face. Her injuries were severe. She lost her left hand, along with several fingers on her right hand. The trauma affected not only Charla, but also the medical team who cared for her, many of whom sought counseling after the experience. The physical and emotional scars left by the attack were deep. A toxology report revealed traces of Xanax in Travis's system, which may have contributed to his aggressive behavior. Some speculated that Charla's altered appearance, her changed hair color and curls, may have startled Travis. But the cause of the attack remains uncertain. Charla now lives with the physical and psychological scars, a constant reminder of the day her life was nearly taken by a creature she had once trusted. It was April 2017, and 12-year-old Christian Prinsloo, known as Tian to his friends and family, was enjoying his school holiday in the South African countryside. As the 2-week break began, Tian made his way to his grandmother's home near Lefalale, a quiet town on the edge of the Bushveld. It was a time of adventure for him, a chance to escape the routine of everyday life. Little did he know, this trip would end in a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Tian's grandmother, Mary Strydom, had a home nestled in the heart of South Africa's wild landscapes. The area was known for its sprawling farms, vast open fields, and the occasional wild animal sighting. Mary had lived there for years, deeply connected to the land and the tight-knit farming community. It was a place where Tian had spent many holidays, surrounded by the peace and beauty of rural life. He enjoyed the quiet days spent exploring the area, reading in the local library, and visiting nearby farms to see the animals. But there was one place Tian particularly loved to visit, a farm where his family friends, the Voss couple, raised lions. They were a quiet but dedicated couple who ran a breeding facility for these majestic and dangerous animals. They kept 3 adult lions, hand-raised but still wild in their instincts. The Voss couple treated the lions with care and respect, making sure their cages and enclosures were secure. The lions were kept in their enclosures, only allowed to roam the property under the watchful eyes of their owners, or so it was believed. It was on this farm that Tian, accompanied by his grandmother, spent an afternoon chatting with the Voss couple. It was a casual visit, one Tian had made many times before. The lions had already been out for their daily walk and had returned to their enclosures by the time Tian and Marie arrived. As the adults spoke over tea, Tian was oblivious to the danger that was about to unfold. The house was bustling with activity. Mary and Mrs. Voss were in the kitchen while Tian moved about looking for his favorite book. What he didn't know was that, unbeknownst to the adults, one of the lions had escaped its enclosure. A gate, left ajar or improperly closed, had given the lion the opportunity it needed. No one realized the danger until it was too late. In the blink of an eye, the massive male lion appeared in the doorway. Tian, already familiar with the lions but never completely naive about their wild nature, froze. He had always been told the same thing. The lions were not tamed despite being raised in captivity. But what could have prepared him for the sight of one of these beasts in the house? Marie saw the lion first and immediately stepped between Tian and the predator, trying to shield her grandson with her own body. The lion, though seemingly calm, locked its eyes on Tian and stepped closer, testing the air. Marie, remaining calm despite the mounting danger, urged Tian to run for safety, but it was too late. Tian turned to flee, and in that split second, the lion sprang into action, covering the distance between them in mere moments. Tian never stood a chance. The lion pounced, its claws digging into Tian's small back, its jaws sinking deep into his flesh. With the speed and force of a wild animal, it took him down to the ground. Tian screamed, but his cries were quickly muffled by the weight of the lion's attack. Marie, with every ounce of strength she had left, lunged at the lion, grabbing its thick mane and pulling with all her might. She screamed, calling for help, but it was a losing battle. The lion swiped at her, raking its claws across her arms and shoulders as she desperately tried to protect her grandson. In the chaos, Mrs. Voss returned to the scene. The lion, momentarily distracted, turned away from Tian. It was a fleeting moment of hope, but the damage was already done. The lion, now subdued by Mrs. Voss, was quickly returned to its enclosure, and she rushed to call for help. Marie, however, did not wait. Despite her own injuries, she grabbed the car keys, tossed them to Mrs. Voss, and picked up Tian. She carried him to the car and sped toward the nearest hospital, knowing time was running out. It took them 20 minutes to reach the hospital, but by the time they arrived, it was clear that Tian's injuries were catastrophic. His back and neck were shredded, his breathing shallow and labored. The doctors did what they could to stabilize him, but it was only a temporary measure. The damage to his spine was severe. Tian was airlifted to Pretoria, where he was transferred to a more equipped facility, but even then, the outlook was grim. For 3 weeks, Tian remained in a coma, his body clinging to life through machines. His parents, Herman and Andre Prinsloo, kept a constant vigil, hoping for a miracle. But the miracle never came. On the 26th of April, just one day after his 12th birthday, Tian passed away. His family was left in a state of shock, mourning the loss of their son, who had been full of life and dreams for the future. Meanwhile, the lion, despite the deadly attack, was not euthanized. The Prinsloo family chose not to press charges against the Voss couple, understanding that the lion had acted on instinct, not malice. They made the difficult decision to allow the lion to be rehomed to another facility where it could live out its life in a more secure environment far from human interaction. The tragedy of Tian's death was something no one could have foreseen, and despite the loss, the family did not wish to punish the animal. In the end, the Prinsloo family's decision reflected their understanding of the unpredictability of nature. While they mourned their son's loss, they knew that it was a tragic accident, one that no amount of legal action could undo. Tian's life was cut short by a series of misfortunes, but his family chose to honor his love for animals by ensuring the lion would be treated with respect in its new home. Despite their domestication, these creatures are still driven by primal instincts that no amount of care or training can suppress. Nature, in its purest form, remains untamable, and even the most careful decisions can lead to tragic consequences. It was January 21st, 2023, when Joseph Austin Smith, a 32-year-old plumber from Wichita, Kansas, left for what was meant to be a routine hunting trip. Joseph was known for his infectious humor. At work, he could always be counted on to bring energy to the morning shift, filling the room with laughter at his jokes. He enjoyed the outdoors and had a passion for both hunting and playing the guitar. On that Saturday morning, he and his friend packed their gear, climbed into the pickup truck, and drove out into the rural countryside of Sumner County, Kansas. Kansas is well known for its hunting opportunities. The state boasts 300,000 acres of public land, along with over 1 million acres of private land open to hunters seasonally. Known as one of the top 3 states for pheasant and quail hunting, Kansas also attracts those pursuing deer, particularly in areas like G Springs, just north of the Oklahoma border. Joseph and his friend had set out that day with intentions to hunt doe, looking to make the most of the weekend. The area was wide open and quiet, an ideal place to hunt. The trip was uneventful at first. The two men chatted as the truck bounced over the rough roads. In the back seat, Joseph's friend's German Shepherd, a large, energetic dog, sat with its head out the window, looking out at the passing landscape. The dog was a familiar companion on their hunting trips, always tagging along, and Joseph knew it well. The truck rolled steadily along the tar roads, and the men began discussing the hunt, making plans for where they would set up when they reached their destination. But in their haste to leave, Joseph and his friend had made a critical mistake. They had carelessly thrown their equipment into the back of the truck, including a loaded hunting rifle. The rifle, while secured in the cab with them, was not properly handled. The safety was off, and the rifle was left in a position where the dog could easily interact with it. Without realizing it, the men had set the stage for a tragedy. As the truck rumbled along the dirt roads, the dog, restless in the back seat, shifted its position. It leaned against the rifle, its large paw pressing down on the trigger. The rifle, previously harmless, discharged with a loud crack that echoed through the cab of the truck. The sound was deafening, the shock of it immediate. The dog leapt backwards, startled by the blast. Its sudden movement caused the truck to swerve, and Joseph's friend slammed on the brakes. The pickup truck screeched to a halt. The air was thick with tension, the ringing in their ears the only sound after the shot. Joseph's friend turned to look at him, expecting him to respond to the noise, but instead found him slouched forward in the seat. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a reaction to the shock of the moment, but when Joseph didn't answer and blood began seeping through his shirt, his friend knew something was terribly wrong. In panic, he shook Joseph's body, calling his name over and over, but there was no response. With his heart racing, Joseph's friend grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived within minutes, the sound of their sirens cutting through the still air. Blood poured from Joseph's abdomen, the bullet having passed through the back of his seat and struck him directly in the back, severing an artery. The bleeding was rapid and uncontrollable. Despite the paramedics' swift arrival and their desperate attempts at CPR, it was too late. Joseph had succumbed to his injuries right there, on the side of a rural road, with his friend and the dog the only witnesses to the tragedy. The shock of the event rippled through the community. Joseph, the vibrant and always cheerful man, was gone. The dog, though a familiar companion on many trips, had not been harmed. The investigation that followed painted a tragic picture of a preventable accident. Sumner County sheriffs determined that Joseph's friend was innocent, having made no mistakes other than perhaps in not realizing the danger of leaving a loaded rifle in the cab. The firearm had gone off due to the dog's paw pressing on the trigger, a simple yet fatal mistake. A similar incident had occurred years earlier in Turkey, where a man's dog had stepped on the trigger and shot him dead. It was a stark reminder of the potential danger that such seemingly innocent actions could bring. Kansas's Wellington Fire and EMS Chief Tim Hay, speaking to the press, offered advice in response to the incident. Keep the safety on, unload your guns completely when it's in a vehicle, and put it away in the trunk, he said. His words were a call to action for all hunters, underscoring the importance of responsible firearm handling. Joseph's friend, who had witnessed it all, would carry the weight of that tragic day with him forever. A small mistake, a loaded rifle, and a shifted dog had combined in an instant to change everything. The sorrow of losing someone so full of life was compounded by the knowledge that it could have been prevented, a fact that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the quiet moments after the sirens faded and the investigation concluded, Joseph's legacy lived on through the stories told by those who knew him. His laughter, his energy, and his presence would be missed by all who had the privilege of knowing him. The dog would continue to roam the countryside, but the bond between it and the men who had once shared so many adventures would never be the same. What was meant to be an ordinary hunting trip ended in the kind of tragedy that could have been avoided with simple precautions. Picture yourself in the heart of South Africa's wilderness, where the roar of lions reverberates through the air, mingling with the rustle of wild grasses and distant calls of other creatures. This was the world of Leon van Biljon, known to many as the Lion Man, built from the ground up. In 1985, Leon and his family moved to what was then just open land. Over the years, he transformed it into Mahala View Lion Lodge, a haven for both wildlife and guests. His children grew up surrounded by this vast sanctuary, and by 2006, he had brought in 3 lion cubs, Rambo, Katrin, and Nikita, raising them as if they were his own. Day and night, he stayed by their side, sometimes even sleeping in their enclosure to form a bond as close as family. These lions weren't just exhibits, they were family. Known for his lion walking tours and impassioned talks, Leon dedicated his life to educating visitors, sharing his unique relationship with these powerful predators. Now in his 70s, he moved with ease among the animals he trusted deeply, never imagining the wilderness he knew so well could turn against him in a single moment. On the morning of August 20th, 2019, Leon entered the lion enclosure as he had countless times before, unaware that a mundane trip through the gate would lead to his final moments. The lions were used to his presence. To them, he was part of their world. That day, however, he had a task, repairing a section of the perimeter fence that needed attention. He opened the security gate and stepped inside, calm and sure of himself, the same way he had hundreds of times. He moved confidently, the lions watching as he set his tools down and began inspecting the damaged fence. But then he did something he rarely did. He turned his back to the animals. As Leon crouched down to inspect the fence, everything seemed routine. The lions, Rambo, Katrin, and Nikita, were lounging nearby, watching him in silence, their massive paws resting against the earth. But crouching down with his back turned was a rare sight for them, and the movement seemed to spark a change. One of the lions began to close in, each step silent, the powerful muscles rippling under its coat. Its gaze locked on Leon, who remained oblivious, focused solely on his task. Then, in a flash, the lion sprang forward, covering the distance in seconds. The massive paws dug into the dirt, propelling its heavy frame through the air. Leon, crouched and unaware, was knocked forward as the lion's full weight struck him from behind. He barely had a second to react before the lion's powerful jaws clamped around his neck. The teeth, razor sharp and built to crush, severed arteries and tore through muscle in an instant. The impact and grip were swift and unyielding. For a moment, Leon's body tensed, his limbs reflexively reacting to the attack. But the power of the lion's bite overwhelmed him, rendering him helpless. The lion's head shook instinctively, its hold tightening as it applied hundreds of pounds of bite force, pinning Leon to the ground. Nearby, the other lions rose, drawn by the commotion, their eyes fixed on the scene as their companion asserted dominance over what had once been a familiar figure in their territory. Staff arrived moments later, drawn by Leon's last faint cry. From outside the enclosure, they saw the horrifying scene, a lion standing over Leon's body, its mouth red with blood, while the other two lions circled with an unsettling calm. Realizing the severity of the situation, they immediately contacted emergency responders, knowing any attempt to intervene could turn deadly. As emergency teams arrived, the response was swift but calculated. To secure the area and prevent further tragedy, two of the lions, including Rambo, were shot. The third lion, however, was tranquilized rather than killed, allowing paramedics safe access to Leon's body. In the end, all three lions were euthanized, a heartbreaking conclusion that showed the intense risks of working so closely with powerful predators. As news of Leon's death spread, it resonated deeply within the community. Leon Van Biljorn wasn't just any lion keeper, he was known affectionately as the Lion Man, a title he earned through years of dedicated care and deep connection with the big cats he raised from cubs. His lions were more than mere animals, they were his companions, his children, and he had devoted years to their upbringing and to educating visitors about their importance in the ecosystem. For the staff, the sight of the enclosure without Leon and his lions marked an end of an era at Mahala View, which had been Leon's life's work. The reserve continued operating, though under new management, and with increased caution around the lions still in residence. In the days following the incident, both local and international observers considered the risks of close human-animal interactions. Though his family grieved deeply, they found some peace in knowing he lived and passed away in the presence of the animals he cherished. As Leon's story shows, even the closest bonds with wildlife can shatter in an instant, revealing the unpredictable nature that lies within every predator. Decades of trust unraveled in a single moment, leaving Leon to face the instincts he had spent his life respecting. On October 21, 2008, the crisp autumn air settled over Virginia Beach, Virginia, as the quiet suburban neighborhood on Witch Duck Road began its usual routine. The modest townhouses stood neatly in rows, their windows glowing warmly as residents prepared for the day ahead. But behind the doors of one unassuming townhouse, a silent predator was about to strike, moments away from unleashing a tragedy that would shock the nation. Amanda Ruth Black, 25, was well known in her community for her love of animals. The wife of a Navy officer, Amanda worked at Pet Paradise, a local pet shop, where her knowledge of exotic creatures earned her a reputation as an expert. Her passion for reptiles, especially snakes, set her apart. Amanda's home was a sanctuary for her unusual pets, housing an impressive collection that included a Burmese python, a Mexican king snake, 2 green tree pythons, and her prized reticulated python, Diablo. Amanda's fascination with snakes began in her teenage years and only grew stronger over time. She had a natural talent for handling them, a skill she refined during her years at the pet shop. Her husband shared her enthusiasm, and together they transformed their home into a haven for exotic reptiles. Among her collection, Diablo stood out. At 13 feet long and weighing over 20 pounds, he was a formidable creature. Yet, Amanda believed she understood him better than anyone, treating him with care and confidence born of years of experience. Reticulated pythons, like Diablo, are among the longest and most powerful snakes in the world. Native to Southeast Asia, these serpents can grow over 20 feet in length and possess a constricting force capable of subduing prey much larger than themselves. Despite their striking patterns and allure to reptile enthusiasts, their strength and predatory instincts make them inherently dangerous, even in captivity. Experts have long warned that a snake's natural behavior, seeing anything warm and moving as potential prey, cannot be fully trained out, no matter how much care and experience a handler possesses. Amanda's confidence sometimes led her to take risks. On that fateful Tuesday morning, she made a decision that would prove fatal. Diablo needed medication, a task Amanda had performed before, often with her husband's help. But this time she was alone. Determined to care for her pet, she prepared the syringe and approached his enclosure. Opening the cage with steady hands, Amanda spoke softly, attempting to calm the snake as she reached inside. Diablo's muscular body uncoiled, his tail gently wrapping around her leg, a familiar behavior Amanda had seen since he was much smaller. She lifted the snake carefully, supporting his weight as she prepared to administer the medication. But something was different this time. The lingering scent of Amanda's breakfast mixed with her movements triggered Diablo's primal instincts. To the massive snake, the situation mimicked feeding time. His demeanor shifted in an instant. Before Amanda could react, Diablo lunged, his powerful body wrapping tightly around her midsection. Reticulated pythons are constrictors, subduing their prey by wrapping around them and squeezing tighter with each breath their victim takes. Amanda, realizing the danger, tried desperately to free herself. She clawed at the snake's body, attempting to loosen the crushing coils. But Diablo's strength was overwhelming. Each movement seemed to enrage the snake further. As the python tightened its grip, his massive body reached her neck. Amanda's breaths became shallow, her strength rapidly fading. She fought valiantly, using every ounce of energy to resist. But Diablo's instinct to subdue his prey was unrelenting. Within minutes, the fight was over. Amanda collapsed to the floor as the snake's coils loosened, her life extinguished by the very creature she had loved and nurtured. When Amanda failed to show up for her shift at Pet Paradise, her co-workers grew concerned. She was known for her reliability and had never missed work without calling. That evening, her husband returned home from duty to a scene of unimaginable horror. Amanda's lifeless body lay near Diablo's open enclosure, evidence of a struggle surrounding her. The devastated husband immediately called emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they confirmed that Amanda had died from asphyxiation caused by the snake's constriction. Meanwhile, Diablo was found in a nearby room, defensive and agitated. Animal control officers arrived and, after a tense struggle, safely secured the massive python. At Amanda's husband's request, Diablo was later euthanized. Unable to bear the sight of the remaining snakes, he surrendered them to animal control, ending what had once been a shared passion. The tragedy caused renewed debates about the ethics and dangers of keeping exotic animals as pets. Despite Amanda's extensive experience, the incident showed the unpredictable instincts of such creatures and the significant risks involved in handling them. Advocates for stricter regulations argued that even skilled handlers are not immune to the primal behavior of animals like reticulated pythons. Thank you so much for watching this video where we explored the dangers of keeping exotic animals as pets and the horrific risks they often bring. It was a warm August evening in 2013 when Connor and Noah Barth, two young brothers, set off for what they thought would be another carefree day of childhood adventure in their quiet town of New Brunswick, Canada. The air was thick with the scent of summer, and their laughter echoed as they made their way to the nearby apartment of a close friend. Life, full of promise and innocence, seemed endless. Little did they know, this day, which began like any other, would take a tragic turn no one could have anticipated. The boys, with their boundless energy, had spent the day at a local farm feeding animals and exploring the outdoors. It was a day of simple joys. Afterward, they returned to the apartment, eager to relax before heading back home. The apartment, situated above a reptile store called Reptile Ocean, belonged to Jean-Claude Cisse, a man known in the neighborhood for his extensive knowledge of reptiles. It was a small store, nothing remarkable from the outside, but it housed a variety of exotic creatures, each more intriguing than the last. Jean-Claude was a well-meaning man, passionate about the reptiles he cared for. Among them was a massive 13-foot African rock python, a serpent whose presence in the store was awe-inspiring. It was a creature of power, one that commanded both respect and fear. Jean-Claude had taken the snake in years earlier, after it was found by the Canadian Wildlife Service. The snake had been in a search for a new home after being turned down by the nearby Magnetic Hill Zoo in Moncton. The zoo, unable to provide a proper enclosure, had rejected the python, and Jean-Claude, eager to care for the creature, brought it to his store. Jean-Claude had built an elaborate glass tank for the python, one that spanned from the floor to the ceiling of the apartment. The snake, although large, seemed contained. But what Jean-Claude didn't realize was that the province of New Brunswick had laws prohibiting the ownership of such dangerous animals, and he didn't have the necessary permits to house the python. His oversight, along with a series of careless decisions, set the stage for a disaster no one could have imagined. On that fateful evening, after a day filled with laughter and carefree fun, Connor and Noah found themselves in the living room of Jean-Claude's apartment. Jean-Claude, the father of one of their friends, often welcomed the boys to spend time there. His son had already retreated to his bedroom, leaving Connor and Noah alone in the cozy but now silent living room. The day's adventures had worn them out, and they soon drifted off into a peaceful sleep. Unbeknownst to them, a lurking danger was steadily drawing closer, ready to shatter their tranquility. What no one knew was that in the dead of night, the python had managed to escape its enclosure. The snake, after years of captivity, had been quietly plotting its freedom. The glass tank, although sturdy, was not impenetrable. The lid, which had been loosened over time, finally gave way. The python, with remarkable precision, slid out of its enclosure and made its way across the room. The snake moved with silent grace, guided by its instincts, slipping past furniture and obstacles with ease. It was heading for the vent in the ceiling, a vent that had recently been left exposed when Jean-Claude removed the filter cap to clean it. The snake, drawn by some unknown scent, slithered through the ceiling vent. It was a small opening just large enough for the serpent's slender head to squeeze through. But the snake, determined to explore further, pushed its entire body into the duct system, its muscles flexing as it navigated the narrow space. It moved slowly, methodically, without a sound. The ceiling, which had already been under strain from the weight of the snake, was now in danger of giving way. Above the sleeping boys, the snake maneuvered carefully, its massive body bending and shifting within the confined space. The ductwork creaked under the weight, the sound barely audible in the stillness of the night. It was only a matter of time before the ceiling couldn't hold any longer. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the ceiling buckled. The snake, now free from the confines of the vent, fell to the floor with a heavy thud. It landed directly on top of the boys, who were still in a deep sleep, unaware of the danger that had just descended upon them. The python, disoriented but powerful, immediately coiled around the boys. Its body, thick and unyielding, began to tighten with terrifying force. Connor and Noah woke in an instant, their eyes wide with shock as they found themselves trapped beneath the massive coils of the snake. Panic surged through them, but their movements were slowed by the overwhelming power of the python. The creature's grip was relentless, squeezing harder with each passing moment. The boys fought against the constriction, but the snake's strength was too much. Their screams went unheard, swallowed by the weight of the snake's coils. The python's constriction continued, each breath they took becoming more difficult until the room fell silent once again. By morning, when Jean-Claude arrived at the apartment, the silence was deafening. He stepped into the room, his heart racing as he scanned the space. The ceiling had collapsed and the boys lay motionless, their bodies bruised and lifeless beneath the snake's powerful grip. Jean-Claude rushed to them, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life, but it was too late. The boys were gone, their lives stolen by the very creature Jean-Claude had worked so hard to care for. Blood stained the floor and the snake was nowhere to be found. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the small town. Medical examiners confirmed the cause of death, asphyxiation caused by the snake's constriction. The python had wrapped itself around the boys, suffocating them before they could escape. In the wake of the attack, questions began to surface. Was this simply an unfortunate accident, or was there something more at play? The experts suggested that the snake would not typically act aggressively unless it felt threatened. But how could this happen? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Jean-Claude's decisions had played a crucial role in the tragedy. His failure to secure the snake properly, lack of permits, and disregard for safety contributed to the loss. Authorities charged him with criminal negligence, though the case dragged on for years. In 2015, nearly 2 years after the deaths, Jean-Claude stood trial. His defense argued there was no intent to harm, but the evidence told another story. Despite the case against him, in November 2016, a jury found him not guilty. For the Barth family, no verdict could ease the pain of losing Connor and Noah. Their smiles, frozen in time, became painful reminders of lives cut short. What began as a day of adventure ended in heartbreak, leaving a family to mourn the loss of 2 young boys taken too soon. As the sun set over the quiet town of Zanesville, Ohio on October 18, 2011, no one could have imagined the terror that was about to unfold. Terry Thompson, a 62-year-old Vietnam War veteran, was a man drawn to the extraordinary. His passion for collecting exotic animals began in 1977, when he purchased a lion cub for his wife Marianne. Over the years, his collection grew to include tigers, lions, bears, wolves, and even baboons, housed on his 73-acre property. The animals were a spectacle for neighbors, but their living conditions often raised concerns. Reports of inadequate cages and unsafe fencing became common. Neighbors complained of escapes, and law enforcement was called on multiple occasions. Yet, Ohio's lax laws allowed Terry to continue amassing animals without any significant restrictions. By 2011, his property was home to 56 exotic creatures, many kept in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. In 2008, Terry was convicted on federal firearms charges and served a year in prison. His time behind bars strained his finances and his mental health. He grew paranoid, believing his wife had been unfaithful during his incarceration. After his release, this combination of personal turmoil and mounting pressure would culminate in an act of unthinkable destruction. As twilight fell on Zanesville on that October day, neighbors began to notice strange occurrences on Terry Thompson's sprawling property. Horses in the nearby paddocks, usually calm and grazing, were unusually agitated. They snorted loudly, pacing back and forth with unease. Their frantic behavior caught the attention of Terry's neighbor, Sam Kopchak, who decided to investigate. Kopchak was an experienced horse owner, but even he felt a creeping sense of dread as he approached the paddock. When Sam reached his own horse, a mare named Red, he saw the source of the animal's distress: a massive black bear lumbering through the field. The sight was startling, but not entirely unheard of in rural Ohio. However, as Kopchak moved closer, he spotted something that froze him in his tracks: a fully grown African lion. The male lion stood just beyond the paddock fence, its golden mane catching the dim light, its piercing eyes fixed on him. The fence separating them seemed inadequate against the size and power of the predator. Realizing the imminent danger, Kopchak quickly led Red into the barn and locked the doors behind him. Inside the barn, with his heart pounding, he called 911 to report the sighting. The call was the first of many as chaos began to spread throughout the area. Unbeknownst to his neighbors, Terry Thompson had spent the hours before orchestrating the unthinkable. Using wire cutters, he methodically opened the enclosures of 50 of his exotic animals, releasing lions, tigers, wolves, and bears onto his property. To ensure the predators ventured out of their cages, Terry scattered raw chicken around the grounds, a final act of calculated chaos. What could drive a man to such a drastic act? Whatever the motive, Terry had unleashed a nightmare on the small town of Zanesville. After setting the animals loose, Terry walked to the front yard of his home armed with a handgun. He raised the weapon to himself and pulled the trigger, ending his life in the middle of the chaos he had created. When officers arrived hours later, they found his body on the lawn, partially consumed by one of his own tigers. While Kopchak remained barricaded in his barn, the chaos outside grew more terrifying by the second. Through the small, dusty windows, he watched as more predators appeared from the shadows. Wolves sprinted across the field, their eyes glowing in the dim light. A massive tiger, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its striped coat, stalked through the tall grass. Then a lioness emerged, her gaze fixed on the paddock as though scanning for prey. Inside the barn, the air was thick with tension. Kopchak knew the flimsy wooden doors were no match for the powerful creatures roaming just feet away. He held his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears as he tried to stay as silent as possible. Speaking as quietly as he could, Kopchak finally placed his 911 call. His words were frantic and urgent, painting a chilling picture of the nightmare outside. At the same time, emergency calls from across Zanesville came pouring in. Predators freely roamed the town, causing chaos and destruction. A soccer coach a mile from Terry's property reported a tiger near the edge of a practice field, prompting parents to evacuate their children. Elsewhere, a motorist narrowly avoided a collision with a black bear. When officers arrived at Terry's property, they found enclosures wide open and predators roaming freely. Lions and tigers lingered near the driveway, while bears and wolves ventured closer to neighboring homes. The danger was spreading rapidly into residential areas, and officers had no choice but to act. Tranquilizers were unavailable, a grim reality that left officers with few options. Wildlife tranquilizer guns, typically used by specialists, were not a part of standard police equipment. Even if they had been accessible, the delay in sedative effects and the difficulty of tracking animals in the dark made tranquilization unfeasible. Law enforcement had to prioritize immediate public safety over saving the animals' lives. The order was given to kill any of the wild animals found before they could cause more damage. By morning, the full extent of the devastation was clear. Of the 50 animals released, 48 had been killed, their bodies strewn across fields and roads. The remaining 2, a grizzly bear and a monkey still in cages, were safely removed. Terry's home was found in disarray, reflecting years of neglect and chaos. What caused Terry Thompson to spiral into a complete breakdown? And why did he choose to inflict such gruesome suffering on his community? These questions will linger forever, the answers lost with Terry's tragic death. But the bloodshed in Zanesville was just one case of the nightmare that can result from keeping wild and exotic animals as pets. On a frigid December morning in 2018, the snow-covered landscape of Ozersk, Russia lay in deep silence. The forest surrounding the small, remote town was blanketed in white, its towering pines standing motionless against the icy wind. It was the kind of morning that felt timeless, where nature reigned supreme. But on the outskirts of town, this peaceful scene masked the aftermath of a tragedy that would leave the community both horrified and bewildered. Sergei Grigoriev, 41, was a man deeply connected to the wilderness. Born and raised in the rural outskirts of Ozersk, he had spent his life living off the land, hunting for food, and selling furs to make a modest living. To those who knew him, Sergei was a rugged outdoorsman, perfectly suited to his isolated lifestyle. His 2 loyal dogs were his constant companions, joining him on hunting trips or lounging by the fire in his rustic home. But Sergei's most unusual companion was a massive brown bear named Grumbler, a wild predator that he had raised from a cub. Grumbler had come into Sergei's life 4 years earlier after Sergei shot and killed the bear's mother in self-defense. Finding 2 orphaned cubs hiding nearby, Sergei built a makeshift enclosure on his property, caring for them until he could find homes. While 1 cub was adopted, Grumbler remained. Sergei refused to part with the bear after learning potential adopters planned to use it as bait to train hunting dogs. Instead, he kept the animal, believing he could provide it with a better life. For years, Grumbler lived on Sergei's property, initially roaming freely but later confined to a sturdy cage after an incident in which the bear injured one of Sergei's dogs. Despite warnings from neighbors and family, Sergei insisted that Grumbler was harmless as long as proper precautions were taken. However, by 2018, Grumbler had grown into a fully mature brown bear. Weighing hundreds of pounds and driven by instincts Sergei could no longer control. That December, Sergei's closest neighbor Dmitry visited for their monthly tea. As they chatted, Dmitry noticed Grumbler pacing restlessly in his cage. He remarked that the bear, like all of its kind, should have been hibernating during the harsh winter months. Instead, Grumbler seemed agitated, pulling at his chains and growling softly. Dmitry warned Sergei, but as always, Sergei dismissed the concerns, confident in his ability to handle the animal. The following morning, Sergei decided to let Grumbler out of the cage to stretch his legs. He believed the bear's agitation was due to lack of movement, and a short walk on a leash would calm him down. Holding the heavy chain that served as the leash, Sergei opened the cage and let Grumbler out into the snowy yard. The bear followed at first, but when the chain tightened, Grumbler began to resist. Straining against the restraint, the animal pulled with such force that the wooden post anchoring the chain creaked ominously. As the post gave way, Sergei grabbed the chain to stop the bear's escape. The sudden resistance enraged Grumbler, who instinctively turned on Sergei. With one massive swipe of his paw, the bear struck Sergei across the chest, shattering his sternum and sending him sprawling into the snow. Sergei, struggling to breathe with his crushed ribcage, was defenseless as the bear charged again. This time, Grumbler's teeth tore into Sergei's head and neck, ending his life in seconds. The commotion brought Sergei's 2 dogs racing out of the house. Barking and snarling, they tried to protect their owner, but their efforts only drove Grumbler into a greater frenzy. The bear struck one of the dogs with a powerful blow, sending it crashing into the cage. Turning its fury on the second dog, Grumbler attacked with relentless force, leaving the animal lifeless in the snow. When the chaos finally subsided, Grumbler dragged Sergei's body into the yard and began feeding on the remains. For 2 weeks, the bear lingered on the property, guarding what was left of Sergei and occasionally retreating into the woods. It wasn't until Sergei's sister Maria arrived to check on him that the gruesome scene was discovered. Spotting blood in the snow and Grumbler pacing near the remains, Maria fled and called the authorities. Police arrived shortly after and tracked Grumbler into the forest, his massive paw prints leading deep into the snowy wilderness. Armed and on high alert, the officers found the bear hiding among the trees near the property. Grumbler was shot and killed on sight to prevent further attacks, his death marking the end of the tragic chain of events. Inside Sergei's modest home, officers discovered a heartbreaking scene. His surviving dog, emaciated and trembling, had managed to avoid the bear's wrath but was barely clinging to life. Covered in bruises and too weak to stand, the dog was rushed to safety and later taken in by Sergei's sister Maria. She nursed the animal back to health, describing it as the only piece of her brother she had left, and a reminder of her brother's fierce loyalty to his animals even in the face of danger. Sergei Grigoriev's death highlighted the dangers of keeping wild predators as pets, even when raised from infancy. His confidence in his bond with Grumbler blinded him to the animal's instincts, which, as the tragic incident proved, could never be fully suppressed. Thank you for watching this compilation of the most shocking exotic animal attacks on owners. If you're interested in more intense and gripping stories, don't miss our shark attack compilation featuring some of the most devastating incidents ever recorded. Just click on the screen to watch now. We'd love to see you there.